Hello everyone, and DSC SKCT is back with another exciting session. Web development is one of the fastest growing domain in computer science and engineering, and even it has lot of options too. Many students has requested like how to get started with web development and all. We have an awesome session like how to get started with web development by Pranav, who is working as software consultant at Ajira Tech. So he has a good amount of experience. So he has also contributed to open source too. So he would be guiding you, and you can ask your questions at the end of the session. So now Pranav will introduce himself, and he'll start the session. Thank you, Pranav. Thank you, Pranav, for coming in.
Yeah. Hello, guys. My name's Pranav. I'm very excited to be sharing what I know with all of you also, because to be honest, even I very recently became a full stack developer. I did my college in 2019. I graduated from BITS Pilani for a BTech computer science degree. While in college, I had by end of first year, I was up and running with development. As always is the trend, I started with backend development because I thought it was, I don't know, cooler than front-end development, which was proven wrong to me later on. But then I worked with this open source organization for like 3 years, and I'm still working on it, but I did most of my development when I was in college. I worked as a tech leader in a startup in college for a while, and after college, I ended up joining Ajira Soft, which is a software consulting firm, and I've been here for a year now. So I wanted this talk to be a lot of focused, a very lighthearted talk, which won't delve into the details of web development. It will just be like very basic starters on how to get up and running, because everybody knows, right? When you really like what you're doing and when you get excited about building stuff, you can keep going on and you won't need people to guide you then. So I would focus very much on just like a refresher breather type course on all of the different types of web development, the stack that's available to you. And I'll also share with you some personal pitfalls and obstacles that I faced myself when I started learning, and things that I felt that I could have done better before maybe I got started with something which might apply to you guys and might save you like some time. So
cool, guys. So you can start the session. Yeah, Pranav.
Sure. All right. So since I gave you like a quick intro on how we are going to be doing this session, I would also say that we are going to use a real life example. We won't actually be writing code or seeing code in this presentation, but we would be actually using an example to go through the entire tech stack that is available to us. So let me just start off. So Pikachu says hi. If people don't know who Pikachu is, it's a Pokemon. But yes, so since we talked about an example that we're going to use for this talk, we would say I just want to build a website that functions as a Pokédex. So this Pokédex is basically, for people who don't know what it is, Pokemons are all basically like you could say some cartoon animals, and a Pokédex is basically an index of all of these Pokemons. So you could basically, let's say, if I want to find information about Pikachu here, I would just type the name or give the ID, and I would get back all the information about this Pokemon. So pretty simple. Sounds simple, right? Yeah. So the requirements I want off of this website are, number one, I want to query a Pokemon by its name and allow filtering by type. So each Pokemon can have some types. It's almost like saying tagging animals to like mammals or reptiles. Pokemon will be thunder type or fire type. So that's a basic tagging system. And I want to give a name and get the details of the Pokemon, which is what I want to do in this entire website. And each Pokemon will have a name, a type, an ID, and an image. So this simple website, we are going to go from the front end to the back end to the server to deployment and everything, and you'll get a rough idea of how the entire stack works. So let me go ahead. Also, what we'll be following in this entire talk is what you see to what happens approach. So I would be going from top to down. So you will be seeing a UI, right? You'll be seeing a website. So we'll talk about what happens there. And then we'll talk about what needs to happen in the backend for whatever you see on the front end to be seen. So let's go ahead. So this is a very rough cartoony image of how the full stack works. So you guys would be familiar with web apps and mobile apps. Basically, whatever app you use on your phone, whatever web app you have, which is Facebook, Instagram, any web app that you see, all of them are just what you actually are display websites. I mean, so you see some content on there that is polished and pretty and everything. And for things to get displayed there, you need information from something called the server. So for instance, if we are talking about Facebook as an example, Facebook server provides information to both the web app and the mobile app. So they both utilize a common source of truth. And the server is basically like, let's say, the human brain. Like it takes information from different paths and then sends it to the part of the website that displays it. So the server actually queries the information from our database. So this database is actually what contains all of this information. The file server is basically what contains all of the files, images, and static files, basically. But the server acts as the medium. It's sort of like the brain that decides, okay, take this from here. If it doesn't exist, decide what to do, and then give it to the web app or mobile app, which decides how to display it. Or if it wants to do any other filtering or any other computational on the front end. But the server acts as the bridge between all of these other components. So let's go ahead. All right. So since we talked about a system where we are going to follow a what you see to what happens, right? So let's talk about the UI, the user interface. The user interface is basically whatever you see on the website. It's the clicks you see, it's the colors you see, it's the images you see, it's basically anything that makes the website look nice and the way the website is displayed. So now you see this UI that we have here. There is a name here, there is an ID number here, and there's a drop-down picker. So this basically will be our interactive element where we decide which Pokemon we want to query. And there is like a basic description, there's an image, and there are some statistics here, basically. And this is the user interface that you're seeing. All right. So now, what are the static elements that don't change here, and what are the paths that you can interact with is the question. So we know that the only interactive element that we have here is this picker. So now if I click this drop down, what would happen is I would get a more exhaustive list of Pokemon. Maybe I'll get a few more Pokemon, or maybe 20 more, 100 more, whichever. So now when I press a different Pokemon, what I want to display the different Pokemon's details. So how we get that details would be the job of the backend. But so we have established that this picker will be your interactive element. So on clicking the different value in the picker, we are going to go ahead to a different stack to actually get the value. Another slightly more dynamic element would be what you see here in the type. So you see that there is a fire type and there's a flying type. So now there are different colors to depict each of these. So in the front end, you could basically find out what is the type of the Pokemon that you're actually retrieving, and then decide, okay, how do I display this? If it's a fire, I want to display it with maybe an orange box. If it's thunder, I might want to display it with, I don't know, yellow or blue maybe. And if it's water, blue, obviously. So this, yet again, is another dynamic element. Everything else, basically, this we display from whatever we get from the values. Okay, so let's move ahead with the next one. Okay, so now developing the actual user interface. So now we have seen what all there is in the actual user interface, right? We have saw that there are pickers, there are images, there are text, this text. So whatever you actually see can be implemented with three basic things. Like as I'm saying here, your best friends while developing these user interfaces are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So most people do learn HTML and CSS quite early on, but we seriously underrate the importance that we give to it, because it's in the end, whatever ideas or that you come up with, you can design the algorithm, but without it looking pretty, it's not going to be like very effective, is it? There's nothing more happier than seeing your ideas come to life, come to fruition by yourself. So even with, like, there are a lot more modern front-end frameworks and technologies, right? But even with all that, these golden three remain very useful to mock up templates in a way that's very easy to understand. And I would definitely recommend practicing front-end development with these three before venturing forth into any other frameworks. Like every other framework has their own utilization, but these three are at the core of everything. Basically, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will be your bread and butter while working with anything that's on the front end. All right, so move ahead. All right, so now we have to also find out, now that we know that anything can be actually be built with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we need to figure out whether should we build everything with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is the question here. I mean, we know we can build it, but can we actually leverage some of these frameworks to make our life easier? And we'll talk about that. So there are some pitfalls of a pure HTML, CSS, and JavaScript implementation. Number one, like as I've mentioned here, code repetition. For example, if we were to reuse this Pokemon picker, that drop down that we saw, right? We can write that with a pure JavaScript implementation that actually fetches information from our backend. But if we were to, let's say, use this in another page, we would have to reuse this code. So this results in some scalability issues when, let's say, you need to make a fix or you want to change the design of this dropdown, you'll have to change it in everywhere that you have repeated it. Now, second one, code organization. The usage of front-end frameworks actually makes your code very, very readable. And like you could actually keep the models separate. You could actually keep your, let's say, the services that communicate with the backend separate. You could keep your display templates separate. And the overall organization becomes very clean. And as a developer who's been contributing to open source organizations, I would stress that code organization helps like to a very, very great extent, because if, let's say, you want a friend to jump in and help you out, or another developer to come in and understand what's going on, if the code is not organized, it's going to be, you're going to waste so much time just explaining to the other person how you want them to like develop. So when a need of building a robust and a maintainable UI, which you think you're going to expand, for example, from Pokédex, I want to make a game out of it, or I want to add more things. I want to maybe add Pokemon from that same website. I want to delete Pokemon from that same website. If I want to keep scaling it up, then that's your cue that you have to make the transition to front-end frameworks. So the most common front-end frameworks that are very popular, you might have heard of them. It's Angular, React, and Vue.js. And from a personal experience, I started off with AngularJS. It was because my open source organization, it's called Oppia. It uses a Google App Engine, which is Python. It's a Python framework as its backend, but it uses Angular as its frontend. So I wanted to become a full stack developer. So since I was working there, I started off with AngularJS. And trust me, honestly, I was awestruck at the sudden possibilities that you could actually do on the client side with AngularJS, and I instantly fell in love with front-end development. But after that, I've been experimenting with React.js, and I recently worked for the last 6 months with Vue.js, which I surprisingly find to be amazing, honestly. Like the architecture of your applications, and it's just a very friendly front-end framework to start off with. So I would definitely recommend any of these three frameworks are pretty good, and they have their own advantages. But Vue.js, I found it to be a very friendly framework to start off with. So that's like a nice one to start with. Let me go ahead. All right. So now that we have established the user interface, the designs, and the tools that you would need to build that, now we need to decide, okay, now we have the tools to build the user interface. Now, where do we get this information from? Like, it's quite obvious that we're going to get the information from the server, which will get it from the database. But now, so from the user standpoint, when the user inputs the name of the Pokemon in the search box or picks a Pokemon from the drop-down picker, now the backend will be giving it to us, to the front end, to display. In technical terms, let's say, the front end basically does what is called a HTTP request on a REST endpoint exposed by our backend, asking for the information of the Pokemon while supplying it with the Pokemon ID or the name. Talking in detail about HTTP protocol and REST architecture delves a bit deeper than our scope here, but I'll emphasize that it is very, very important to take the time and learn about this. For instance, HTTP protocols, there are get endpoints, there are post endpoints, there are put endpoints, there are delete endpoints. So the entire REST architecture and way of writing RESTful APIs, they are a very good like it's a very important thing for you to, for everybody who's starting off with web development to learn about in detail. Because when I started off, I just used whatever libraries I had and developed them, but without like in-depth knowledge, I faced some difficulties moving forward, and I had to sit and learn all of it back later. So it's actually good to set your fundamentals straight while starting off with development. All right. So now we have established the user interface, and we have established that the user interface is going to ask the server. Now the server, it's the brain behind the beauty that you see. Whatever you see, whatever makes that happen is the server. For any backend framework, you might have heard of Django, Node.js, Ruby on Rails. They're all server-side frameworks. So the server basically knows where to obtain information from and where to store information. It knows where to send information, who's allowed to send information, whether they're authenticated, and whether it should reject unauthorized people asking for information. Basically, any kind of computation, algorithms, everything the server usually handles. Now, in this context, what do I need from my server? Now, the server needs to give the front end the Pokemon info it asks for. Now to do this, don't we need the information first? Where does the server get the information from? We could spend our time manually entering the details of each Pokemon into our database, but why reinvent the wheel? We can just use a third-party provider who would give us the Pokemon details, because Pokemon is quite a big brand. So there must be someone who already has a database of all the Pokemon that's available, right? So we can maybe find out if they will expose their data to us. Maybe they have a REST API that gives us this information, and if we can get that information from them once, then we can just store it in our database. So that actually saves us a lot of time manually entering into our database all of our Pokemon information. Like, and again, personally speaking from experience, most web developers generally stray away from front end and try starting with back end, because I've seen people from my college do it, I did it, and it always seemed like the back end was cooler and more interesting stuff happened here because it's actually what drives the website. But as time went on, I figured out that moving full stack was a very good choice, and like front end development is as interesting, if not more. It can be more interesting than back end development. So, all right, let's go ahead and see how we are going to obtain this Pokemon information, maybe from a third-party API. Now, while I start with querying a third-party API, an API we talked about is basically, it's called an application process interface. So it's something that exposes some information to another person, and sometimes you can have authentication in between to make sure that the correct person who needs the information is the person getting it. For example, very simple pet projects, people might have worked with the Facebook API or the Twitter API. So I can set up a Twitter API and give Twitter the authentication details of my login account and details. And in my website, I can start, I can have an own website where I can stream the data from Twitter when there are tweets I follow, and just stream that in my website. So basically, this is not data I own. This is not data that I have stored in my database, but this is the data that I'm getting from a different person. It's a third-party API. So they have given us this data, and we're going to use it. So this is exactly similar. I found out that there's a service called pokeapi.co that provides us details about a Pokemon. So basically, what we need to do is just make a REST API call, endpoint call, onto this service, this Poke API service, and they would give us the actual information that we need. They would give us, maybe if we ask one Pokemon, they will give us the details of that Pokemon. Maybe if we ask them for the list of all the Pokemon, they would give us the list of all the Pokemon. Now, since we know that the service like this exists, we can take technically one of two approaches. Say, first one, let me talk about it and tell you what's the problematic with that approach. So whenever the front end asks us for the Pokemon info, we can just ask this third-party API, right? Why even bother saving anything in our local database? I mean, it anyway gives us information, we can just keep asking them. But, so there are problems here. Think about latency. Latency is basically the time taken. So let's say that any request that comes from the front end to our server, now the server needs to wait on this third-party API. Now the server needs to send that request to pokeapi.co, we need to wait for a response from them, and then after we get that response, we need to send it to the front end. So this communication between us, our server, and this Poke API service is not something we can control. I mean, it's not in our hands this entirely. So it will take more time than querying from a database, definitely. Now, what if Poke API decides to do some maintenance and they put their server down, maybe for an hour? Now our front end is completely unusable. Nobody can get any Pokemon information because we relied on Poke API and Poke API wasn't up. So these are the problems with depending entirely on a third-party information. Now the second approach, we come to the second approach where we decide, okay, Poke API might not be the most reliable way of getting information consistently. So I could probably get it once when it's consistent and then just store it from on my side, which is what would be a smart thing to do. Now I would ask Poke API once, okay, give me all the Pokemon information you have and take only the parts I need in my website. Like I need the name, I need the image, I need the description, I need the type. So just take these information, store it in our database, and whenever the front end asks for information, take it from our database. Now this is something that we can control because a database getting into maintenance, we'll also put a front end into maintenance, and we are not depending on any external developers. So now because of this, we have basically obtained the information we wanted and also made sure that the communication between the front end and the server is pretty clean. All right. So now that we know that we are going to store Pokemon info in our database, let's talk about that. Let's talk about databases. So databases, I mean, quite common. You might have heard about all of these names: SQL, structured query language. You might have heard of PostgreSQL. You might have heard of MongoDB. Like MongoDB is part of the mean stack for a lot of full stack developers. But databases are fundamentally, they are the storehouse of all of our information. In, let's say, talking about this website that we want to build, the Pokédex website, we'll have to store all of this Pokemon information in our database, right? So to store all this information, we need to represent each Pokemon as a data point or a data row in our database table. Now, looking at our UI, we decided that we would need these following items. We would need the ID of the Pokemon, which is a number that uniquely identifies a Pokemon. Pokemon ID 1 is Bulbasaur, for instance, and going forward 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which goes up to, I think, some 800 odd Pokemon. But yeah, and then we have what is called the Pokemon name. Now, this is a string, which is the name of the Pokemon. And we have the Pokemon type, which is a mixture of predefined values that tags a Pokemon to the types it can possess. It can be 1, it can be 2. I don't think it can be more than 2, but let's say for scalability's sake that it can be more than 2 also. Can be any number of types. Now, and then we have finally a Pokemon image. This is basically a URL that links that contains a link to the image of this Pokemon, which we can use whenever we get this link information. At a very, very minimal scale, these 4 fields are enough for our basic implementation of a Pokédex. But now, when you actually start working with databases in live applications, you will actually be imposed a very important question. The question is basically whether you need to use a relational or a non-relational database. So it would be really great to actually spend some time and learn about the differences between these relational and non-relational databases, because that actually it helps you decide which database you need for your application, which would be the most optimal. SQL and PostgreSQL are both relational databases, while MongoDB is a non-relational one. It's a NoSQL DB. So I'll just give a very fleeting explanation because delving into it is a separate topic in itself. So let's say a relational database is basically a database where you will have to make sure that your entire schema is going to be rows in a table. So there you'll have to make sure that all of these row entries all need to be consistent. For instance, I already have, let's say, some 20 Pokemon that only have these 4 fields. Now, when I add my, let's say I want to add another Pokemon field. Let's say I call it height. I want to store another information called Pokemon height. Now, in a relational database, I can't just go ahead and add this Pokemon height and start inputting new Pokemon here, because there are already some 20 odd Pokemon that don't have the height feature. So now we have to spend the time to make sure that we are able to provide that height information for that first 20 Pokemon. And then after the database is now in a stable state, now move ahead with adding more Pokemon that have this height attribute. In a non-relational database, conversely, it's everything is stored as documents. So here you can actually work, it's no SQL basically. You can work without these schema constraints, provided that you have a reliable way of handling Pokemons that don't have a height when you're displaying information. So when you're using a non-SQL DB, you can have some Pokemons that have this height, some Pokemons that don't have this height, and it won't matter as long as you can have a way of handling it and you are sure that your database is going to keep going, having these kind of changes. It's good to use a NoSQL database. So this is a very, very fleeting explanation, but it's a very interesting topic to actually learn more on. So I would actually advise people who want to learn more about web development and databases to actually get started, get more information on this. Right. So we have more or less discussed what happens from the front end to the back end. So to discuss the complete flow in like a nutshell, the flow goes: a user visits our website. From the drop-down picker, requests information about, let's say, 01 Bulbasaur. Now, our front end decides, okay, we need to ask the server for this information. Our server could maybe check whether Bulbasaur exists in the database of Pokemon that we already have. And if we have that information, we can just return it back to the front end, who would just display it. Now, the server doesn't have this information. The server also has to tell the front end what to do if it doesn't have this information, right? We could maybe have a flow where we check with the third-party provider, OK API, to see whether they have this information that we don't. And if they don't have it either, we can tell the user that the Pokemon that they asked for does not exist and ask them to query for a different Pokemon. And if they do have it, we can return it back. So a good website would actually think about all of these different flows and see whether, okay, if we have that information, what do we do? Fine, perfect. We have it, we display. But if we don't have it, how do we do it? We can't let the website break for any reason. A good website would always need to handle any of these cases. If we don't have the information, gracefully tell the user, okay, we don't have this, please query for a request. Request for a different Pokemon. It's quite simple when broken down, honestly. Okay, so what I've talked about so far is basically the things involved in the entire workflow of web development. Now, this moving on, if you want to truly control everything that happens in the web development process from scratch to making it go live, and you want to advance your skill set, it will be a very helpful skill set to actually know a bit more. Now, hosting services. So these will actually be the services that make your website go live. Now, I can build whatever website I want on my local machine, but nobody else will be able to see it until it's up on a server somewhere, right? So you must have heard of services, Amazon Web Services, AWS, and DigitalOcean, and Microsoft Azure. And all of these people are basically providing services. Basically, they are providing us a space to keep our website, and it's on the internet so that other people can access it. Now, how this works in a very fleeting description is basically you get something called a VPC. It's basically a server space. So AWS and DigitalOcean, they have computers and servers across the world, and they would provision us some space from their server. It could be an entire computer, it could be a part of a computer. And what we need to do is we need to move our code base there. Whatever we have developed, whatever website we have developed on a local machine, we can move our code base to that server space. Now, what we would next ideally do is, let's say we built our Pokédex, right? I would call it maybe Pokédex-pranav.com, let's say a domain website. So now we would need to purchase a domain name for this website. And after we have this domain, we can link requests to that domain and send them to the VPC we just purchased from these cloud services. So when we are sending this information to these cloud services, now this our server which exists there will know how to handle this. So again, a very rough idea that you'll need to set up, and you could set up what I would normally do is an Apache and Nginx server, which basically Nginx is what will be proxying your request. So when you're getting requests to this domain name, it will knows to send it from the domain name to the website that we have. And they additionally, these services also provide us ways to deliver media content in an efficient manner. For instance, a place to store our Pokemon images and retrieve them instead of just retrieving it from our database. So, from a personal experience, again, I had a super fun time learning the ins and outs of deployment. I spent most of my time on deploying websites on DigitalOcean, and honestly, I found it really really tough at the onset because I couldn't really find proper documentation of Nginx and Apache and using and deployment on the servers. And but when you can experiment with all these possibilities, it gets super exciting, and uh, you actually get like a sense of satisfaction because now it's a very niche part of the it's a development process. And when we are able to master it, you feel like you have the entire stack mastered. Like you can go from writing the first hello world statement on your framework to getting that website live. Now you hold power over this entire stack, which excited me a lot. I mean, honestly. And yeah, this probably is already overstated a lot, but it deserves all of that overstating. Version control, Git. Like this is the most important aspect of development in modern times. Like services like GitHub, GitLab, they have made collaboration and version control so easy. Like learning, it's basically a place on the cloud where you can keep all your entire code base, and different developers can work together and develop their applications, and they can in an organized and structured manner make changes to the code base with making sure that everybody has the same version of the code base. So for learning, so GitHub basically has a terminal language called Git. So learning Git and using it from the terminal is a really really helpful tool, and it's very very simple to learn. And I would actually ask everybody who's planning on learning web development, before anything, prioritize Git. Git will help you a lot in actually moving forward with development and working with bigger teams and everything. All right, so since given you a rough overview of everything that happens in the tech stack, I want to also talk to you a little bit about my personal journey and learnings. So I first picked up Django to learn, and because I was good in Python and Python was very easy to get started with, and I did lots and lots of pet projects and just tried to work anywhere I found work. Then I slowly started with open source development, and I forayed into AngularJS, and then I picked up a little bit of Java, and also learned Vue.js and Flutter. Now, learning all of these frameworks, like the point one I say, there's like you figure out from experience the right way to learn a framework. I mean, trust me, like there are already some 15 frameworks that come up every year. In every 2 years, whatever we know now is going to be irrelevant. And a good software developer, web developer would keep up to date with all of these changes. They would have to keep relearning and relearning and relearning. So by this time, we actually need to maybe like figure out what works for us and get the perfect way to learn any new framework. What I found out that works for me is a very fun, tiny personal project that touches upon a lot of things that you might need in the framework. For instance, in my 11th standard, the program that I wrote that actually got me interested in development was a hand cricket program. Most people might know what it is. It's basically two people just play against each other and they put numbers, and if the numbers match, that's an out. Otherwise, the numbers add up, they get a score. It's a very simple way of playing cricket. But I try to build it using, let's say, one that plays with a user against a computer. The computer will basically throw a random number between 1 to 6 every time. The user will have to input a random number every time. If those numbers match, the user's out. The numbers don't match, the user's runs get added on. Now, this is super simple. You will be touching on very simple computations and random number generators, but it takes very less time. And if I want to learn, let's say, web development, I would build a very minimal user interface that plays against the computer and the user. If trying to learn a new framework for mobile app development, I would try to code a hand cricket app. So I found out that this actually helped me a lot when I wanted to learn a new framework. Part two, the second point that I wanted to stress on is the advent of the new front-end wave. The reason that front-end framework and development is actually getting importance, so much importance in recent development is because earlier the case was that people's phones and people's laptops and computers, they did not have a lot of processing capability. People had very less processing power and compared to actual servers which needed way more processing power. So what had to happen was that everything that required any computation or any, let's say, algorithm to run, it would run on the server side, and just the information to display would reach the front end so that the mobile phones and laptops could load it fast. But now, most of our laptops and phones have as good a computing power as most servers do. So we figured, why do tiny computations and make calls to servers every time if you can actually do the same thing on the phone or laptop on which it's running? For instance, to do 5 plus 5, I don't need to ask the server to tell me that, right? I mean, most laptops and phones very easily do that. So it's a very simple example, basically, but we can also do increasingly slightly more complex computations on the front end, which is why front end development is actually gaining a boom. And I would say now is the time to actually jump in and make the move to full stack if you already know backend. Third point, the importance of writing clean code, writing comments, and writing unit tests. Okay. Writing code that's readable, writing function names that make sense, writing variable names that make sense, commenting things that might seem vague are all super critical, because seldom are you ever going to be working alone on any project. And most of the times you would be required to work with other people. Most of the times you would be required to do handovers of your code base. And all of these times you would want these people to understand what you have written without you ever being there. And all of these perfectly accomplish all of this. And unit tests also particularly is basically making sure that any algorithm or logic that you have written actually works. I mean, you don't want to, I mean, you could just say that, yeah, I know that 5 plus 5 is equal to 10. I don't need to write a test for that. But let's say that somewhere along the line, you made a small typo and the 5 became a 4. Now our server will basically be checking for why is 5 plus 4 not 10. And you would have overlooked it. And if you had, let's say, had a unit test that checks whether a plus b was 10, then the unit test would throw an error saying that, okay, you made an error here. This is not 10. Please fix it. Now, let's say when your backend becomes more and more diverse, making sure that all of your services, all of your APIs, they're all tested and they are fail-proof. You would never be running into bugs. You would avoid a lot of common bugs that eventually end up creeping in. Point 4 is one that's super personal to me. Emphasis on learning actual SQL. When I started web development, I ended up just learning Django's. There's a term that's called ORM. It's called an object relationship manager. So what it ends up doing is it acts as an interface between the actual database and your Django code. So I never actually worked with SQL because I just used Django's ORM system where I could just communicate with the database and just get whatever I wanted done. But when I made the move to a different framework and I figured out that I actually knew nothing about SQL and I couldn't write any SQL commands and do some easy queries that I could run on these tables, I figured out, okay, I actually found out only last year and I was like, okay, now maybe might be a good time to actually sit back and learn SQL again, relearn SQL, because it's super important and SQL actually helps a lot when they're working with any backend framework. And point 5, when I was a student, when you're a student, you have a lot of places to learn from. I mean, you can learn from courses. You have a lot of these MOOC courses, edX and Coursera, Geek for Geeks. But a lot of these places, they don't actually give you solid development experience. I mean, it doesn't account to industry experience at all. And the only way that I found myself advancing in my the development experience was when I started contributing to open source organizations. So I picked one out because I wanted to apply for this program called Google Summer of Code. For people who don't know about it, students can basically apply to this Google Summer of Code program, and they can submit a proposal to an open source organization that they like. And if you get selected, you can work with that open source organization for 3 months while Google ends up paying you a stipend for working on open source organizations. And it's for students, it's a very good opportunity to actually gain some industry experience, and it's a lot of fun also, honestly. So for this program, actually, I started contributing to an open source organization called Oppia, OPPIA. They are basically they basically try to make learning fun. They have interactive ways of learning, and you can actually go check the website out. It's a pretty interesting project. And I found out that when I joined there, whatever that I was doing on my own, it was actually a very bad. It was a lot of bad quality coding development. So if you wanted to do good quality coding, you would try to join a good open source organization that has standards. So they would generally not allow any bad code to get in. They will make sure that you have your tests covered. They'll make sure that you have named your variables right, your structures right, even pretty code. They emphasize on your code being pretty. You can't, if they say you need to have 2 lines between any 2 functions, you need to have 2 lines between any 2 functions. And honestly, working with Oppia was the biggest career booster in terms of development for me. And I would really advocate open source contributions if you are still a student, because it also counts as valuable volunteering experience. Now, the last part, which is the only part of the development workflow that I'm not still good at and I'm trying to be good at, it's user interface and user experience. It's basically, you might be able to develop the front end that you see, but UI UX is basically deciding what is going to be that front end. It's deciding, okay, where does this image need to be? Where does this button need to be? How big does the button need to be? What font should the button use? What color should the button be? When the button is pressed, what kind of animations that you can have? And how should the flow be? Like how should I respond to the user when they don't have the information they need? And all of this comes under user interface and user experience. And actually being able to design user interface and design experience is the mark of a good product designer, a person who decides how the product needs to look, needs to feel. And I honestly believe that if it's a fun part of the workflow that people might pick up if they want to, but it's not absolutely crucial to be a web developer, because there are a lot of UI UX people that you will end up working with who will give you these designs, and you will end up having to develop these as the front end developers. But it's a pretty fun thing to actually get started with. I mean, I honestly thought that there wasn't a lot to learn there, but then I was proven wrong, and I was shown like how much thought can actually go into designing user interface and user experience. That's basically what I had to share with you guys about my experience being a web developer. And if you have any questions, it's all good. And I would like to thank you for whoever attended.
Sure. And we have questions too. So we can go with questions now.
Sure.
I want to ask some questions. Like many of my juniors have asked me. Like the first question is how to choose a stack in web development. So basically, what people say is that take a JavaScript framework. So as soon as they learn JavaScript, we have a lot of framework: Next.js, Nuxt.js, React, Vue, Angular, and all. And most of the people know only the top 3 things: React, Angular, and Vue. And even there are other good things like Backbone.js, Ember.js. So like how to go with it? Like which framework should choose and start learning?
All right. So in my honest opinion, requirement and proper research will actually lead you to the framework that you need. For instance, there are a lot of JavaScript frameworks apart from the top 3, Vue, React, and Angular. But if you notice, most, if not all, of the requirement that you're going to need of a front-end framework can be solved by any of these 3, including maybe a few other frameworks. So it's more of a need-based and efficiency-based approach that you need to follow for this. I mean, if there are personal preferences that people have when developing. I mean, I didn't like React.js at all because I did not like their way of writing templates. Like React has a way of writing templates called JSX, which is a bit different from HTML. It's almost like writing mobile apps. You'll be writing widget type code programming, and I preferred writing HTML templates. You can definitely do that with React, but out of the box, I preferred it when Angular and Vue.js allowed me to do it. So this was a complete matter of preference. But whatever I wanted to develop, I could have done with all three of these frameworks. So, but as you keep getting more and more experienced, and let's say you start finding problems, you're getting asked to solve problems that maybe a very niche problem, you will start finding out that there are some other frameworks that could actually do what you did better. And the only way that you're going to find out is before you even start developing the framework. I mean, if you see a problem, you don't just jump in and say, okay, I know Vue.js, I will solve it with Vue.js. But you can actually put in the time to do the research and find out if for that particular problem, you might find a very easy way to actually get it done. So that's a very good way to actually go about frameworks, because that's how I found even Vue.js for that matter. And while the entire industry was busy writing with, let's say, React Native for mobile apps, Google just came in from out nowhere and they announced Google announced Flutter. So
Yeah.
Flutter was like pretty great in terms of, in my opinion, I like Flutter didn't have as extensive as a library collection as React Native did, but Flutter had a lot of things that made development super easy. They had this hot reload module that actually writing code to seeing it happen on the app super fast. And Flutter focused a lot on making the UI look pretty, and basically a lot of people wouldn't go to Flutter immediately because many people in the industry would just continue using React Native. But if you put in a little bit of research and find out that your particular use case, you want to, let's say, focus more on the user interface parts of the widgets and everything, and you wanted a smooth development process, and you don't actually rely on a lot of third-party libraries, you would find out that Flutter was actually more preferable to your application than React Native. There are these cases where if you do the research, you'll find out which framework would be more better for your project. But again, let me rehash. Most projects, you can work with any framework.
So nice. So it was really nice answer. So I want to add on. So Flutter with one code base you can have for Android, iOS, and even now Flutter Web is on. So like if you want to get started, you can also try out Flutter. And so we have a next question. It's from Sezubadi. I have one doubt. Is there any possibility that Vue.js become popular in future?
I mean, it could, right? I mean, like I actually adopted Vue.js only like 5-6 months ago, and like I read a case study that they had on their website. I mean, on Vue's website, where they were actually had like a solid comparison between Angular, React, and Vue.js. It was like a chart that went something like Angular and React are still way at the top of adoption as of now, but Vue had a very steady climb up the process, and it was actually not equalizing somewhere. And honestly, going forward, Vue could become more popular. I mean, I honestly I didn't know of Vue until 6 months ago, and suddenly I've tried Vue and it was amazing, and I loved it. And there could be more people who do like it the same. But in this current scenario, I can't. Nobody can say whether Vue will become the next standard, because for all you know, there could be another 5 frameworks that are going to be released in the next 1 year, which could overthrow all of these. So there's nothing that's constant as far as I believe, but Vue is definitely a good framework if people want to start working on it, and I really enjoy working with Vue. So while Angular and React are still good, Vue's quite nice. I prefer Vue in my opinion.
Okay, sure. And we have a next question. I think it's from Samuel. So, what should one focus on when choosing to specialize on back-end web development? Asking as a newbie.
Okay. So if you just want to specialize in backend development, there's so many things that you can work on. All right. So even the backend in itself, they have a lot of layers. So the backend generally has something called let's say people call it the storage layer, people call it the model layer. So it basically, what it does is it mimics your databases design. So you would have to actually model all your databases and all your classes there. And then there comes the services layer. the domain layer. Basically, this domain layer is basically a layer that works with these storage layers and provides data to the next layer that we're going to talk about, which is called the controller layer. The controller layer is actually the layer that communicates with your front end. So they basically handle any incoming requests. It asks the domain layer for information. The domain asks the storage layer for information. Storage layer asks the database for information, and the flow comes back through this. So good, well-architected backend frameworks have all of these as separate layers and separately tested layers and tests that run through all of these layers too, integration layers. So for newbies, it would be for people who are just getting started with backend development, it would be a very valuable skill to actually pick up the ability to segregate all of these and work through them. For example, I started developing in Django backend development, and I actually found the Django's documentation to be pretty great. I mean, they have this getting started with Django app, some 6 parts or 8 parts app, which I found actually to be quite comprehensive and good if you want to develop. I still use it when I'm writing a new Django app because it has a lot of useful information. Now, going past the getting started app, what I would recommend, what the getting started tutorial does not have, is I would recommend working with libraries, like very important libraries. For instance, people who are interested in machine learning, they generally work with libraries like scikit or numpy, which are very important. And uh, when I was in college, I took this machine learning course, and there was a project where I had to do something called image classification. And I built a Django app for it, by the way. And I basically built the Pokedex, like the actual Pokedex. So what I would do is I would pass it this, I pass it a video of which had like a bunch of Pokemons in it. And what it would give me is it would tell me which Pokemon existed in that video. So for this, I wrote it completely using Python, but I had to learn a lot of different libraries. I had to work with, let's say, REST APIs. I had to work with serializers, and so basically picking up projects like these in backend development, they help you use more libraries and learn more things than before. So the only way of moving out of that beginner phase and actually getting to a part where you think you know the framework well, it's actually writing things that you would like doing. It doesn't need to be anything that has like production value. It can just be anything that interests you and just a simple idea, and you'll be using a lot of different frameworks that you would need. And for instance, like the Django out of the box does not give you REST framework API. So there's something called DRF. It's called the Django REST framework, which is a very convenient library for properly writing APIs. So that is a very good starting point for, again, a starting point for people who have gotten past the getting started phase of the Django tutorials and they want to move forward. Learning the Django REST framework is a good continuation part.
Sure. So we have we have a lot, few more questions for you.
Okay.
So this is a question from Darren. What is your favorite web stack?
All right. Okay. A year ago, it used to be Django in the backend, SQLite, which was Django's default SQL database. I used AngularJS for front end, and yeah, HTML, CSS, JavaScript for UI development. And I used to deploy my programs in a DigitalOcean server using Nginx and Gunicon. But now, in retrospect, I would still stick with Django for the backend, but my front end definitely got replaced with Vue.js as my favorite for now. And for deployment, I have started moving over to AWS because honestly, they have everything you need, like everything. So AWS is also like a very expansive area to learn. And so my current stack would preferably be Django, Vue.js, and PostgreSQL database. Yes.
Sure. So we have a next question. I think it's from Coding with Gaurav. Hi, I'm learning MERN stack. and I don't have any degree in CS. I find it bit difficult to crack interviews as I get to see DS and algo questions. Yeah, I think this is one of the needed questions.
Yeah. Uh, for one, I think that you actually need to separate out these two topics, everything. Mern stack, learning me, Mern stack, Mongo, Express, React, and Node.js. It will help you build applications. It will help you get ideas, get ideas working, get your ideas to a fruition. But if you're still in college, this is not what will land you jobs, if that's what you guys are looking for. Like, they're two separate things. This is what actually industry experience, you're actually building things that you need when you're doing web development and learning Mern stack. But your interviews, I presume, like I had my interviews like a year ago, so they generally revolve around data structures and algorithms. So data structures and algorithms are way more down to fundamentals. They are the theories that you need to have strong, because these data structures will actually help you when you work on backend development in the future. Like, you would not be building inefficient data structures when if you know your algorithms and DS solidly, because when you move on to the higher stakes in development, all of these extra milliseconds count. Like, using the most optimal data structure, using the most optimal retrieval algorithm, all of this will matter when you keep moving to high stakes. So learning your data structures and algorithms is a definite must. It is what will be asked in your interviews. But learning web development is a very nice addition to your resume if you're still applying for jobs with a solid DS background. So I would definitely recommend learning DS and algorithms if you're going to be sitting for interviews. But do web development if you have free time, because it's a valuable addition.
Sure. And we have a question from Midun. Hi Pranav, I have been learning front end development for a while, and I am little scared to being learning back end as it feels a little overwhelming. Is there any easy way to begin learning back end?
Uh, I can totally relate to this situation, because the first time wrote, I saw my first Django program, I was boggled. I couldn't grasp heads or tails of actually what was going on, and I was just like, okay, there is something called a view, there is something called a URL, there are some random templating stuff that's happening, and I was like, okay, what's going on? But uh, the only way I got through it is basically reusing what I assumed certain things when I wrote my first program, that this is how it is. And when you rewrite, when you keep doing new projects, you keep relearning some things that you thought you already knew. So starting with a very, very basic app that, again, lets you just go through the entire flow. And for people who don't prefer reading to documentation, there are always amazing YouTube videos available for people to they explain the entire flow of a very simple Django app. But that foundation is what you need. If you can are able to like get to that part where you're able to understand that very basic app from the backend that moves on to the front end, then moving on, you'll be able to grasp everything that comes your way. Basically, that's like that's the easiest way that you can actually get understand these things, because you just need to grasp, let's say, the a flow. Basically, you need to know from where data comes from, what happens to this data, where this data goes. That's the only thing. If you break it down in backend, where data comes from, what happens with it, and where it goes. So if you can understand how it transitions to code, like what happens in the view, what happens in this controller, what happens in this URL file, for instance. So you just need to find the flow that goes through this entire process, and I'm pretty sure you'll be able to understand it very easily.
Sure. And I think we have only one more question. I think this will be the final question as time is running out too. So it's a question from Gaurav. I learned DS and Algo in Java, and now I'm finding it difficult to solve them on JavaScript. So how can you overcome this situation, this problem?
Uh, okay, so you learned data structures and algorithms in Java, which probably means that you are able to write heap sort, insertion sort, binary search trees, and you are able to write Dijkstra's algorithm, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so these are, like, let's say, slightly more complex algorithms that even though you might have learned it in Java, there's a you you might be able to write pseudocode for this, which is what you need to break it down to. Okay, if I can write the Dijkstra's algorithm in Java, what is the pseudocode for it? Write it in simple, readable statements. Write the pseudocode. Okay, now, okay, this is a for loop that iterates over this and marks maybe some nodes as visited, right? So if that's in Java, in pseudocode, it will be, I would be saying for all of these nodes, traverse, if it's already visited, skip it. If it's not visited, then add it to the to visit list. Okay. Now I know what this pseudocode statement means. Now I would go to JavaScript syntax, find out, okay, how would I write the same thing in JavaScript? Now translating this line by line should get you most of the way. But to get a solid grasp of writing JavaScript, forget about Dijkstra's algorithm, go back to simple basics. Write bubble sort, write insertion sort, write like very simple, very simple algorithms. And I'm sure that if you're, because these algorithms are very easy to transition from Java to pseudocode to JavaScript. When you're directly trying to transition from Java to JavaScript, you might face some issues because you might not know the direct correspondence of these syntaxes. But making it into pseudocode will actually help you to do it in any language in the future. I think that's a good way to actually switch languages if you want to.
Sure. And finally, I have one question. So, I see like people want to learn new frameworks, but what are the things, concepts in JavaScript a person should like get clear before they jump into a framework thing, before they jump start learning any framework?
Okay, so before you learn any framework, you basically need to know what's going to be happening to all of this data. I mean, basically, for instance, so you have this, right? This is just a very simple flow, but you basically need to know about the flow of information. So when you understand what's happening behind the scenes, you'll understand what's happening in the code, because you know that some information is coming into the web app. Now that information is flowing from there to the server, from there to the database and file server, and from both of that, it's coming back to the server. From server, it's going back to these apps. Now, that's basically what happens. I mean, however complex it might seem, this is what happens. So now that you know that this is what happens, now try to find out what those lines of code correspond to. It's basically whatever said and done, all of these lines of seemingly complex code corresponds to some flow of information and some handling of information, some manipulation of information. So it will be helpful if you try to understand what's happening behind the scenes rather than just understand the syntax of the framework. And after you get this information flow flat, it will be super helpful before jumping into a framework to actually learn the language that the framework is made up of. For example, before jumping into Angular or React or Vue, it will be very helpful to actually know JavaScript. And the same goes for before jumping into Django or Flask. It's important to know Python. I mean, that's like a given, right? Because that syntax is what these frameworks are built on. And as I mentioned, it's very helpful if you have ideas about all of the HTTP protocols, the status codes, like for what 401 means, what 404 means. I mean, 404 should be pretty straightforward, and what 500 errors mean, what 300 errors mean. And basically, it's very helpful to know these HTTP status codes because they are a crucial part of the web stack while communicating with different services. And it's very helpful to obviously learn about RESTful architecture and databases. I think having a good enough grasp of these fundamentals, you should be perfectly able to jump into any framework to develop.
Sure, Pranav. So it was really an awesome session. Like you explained each and every concept with some interesting example, the Pokemon app. So it was really nice, and the session was like useful for many. And the people have commented like it was really an amazing session, and they learned a lot. So really, thank you, Pranav, for coming in and giving a talk during a weekend.
Yeah, I'm happy to share whatever I
Sure.
have experienced. Thanks for attending. It was very great to like have all your questions and help any developer go through some issues that I had when I was getting started with. I mean, because I can associate a lot more with you guys also because I'm just fresh into this industry.
Okay, so bye guys. So let's meet next week. So we have a design talk next week. Oh, bye everyone, and thanks Pranav, and thanks everyone for attending this guiding talk series on every Sundays. Thank you.
Thanks, Manoj. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.